Hello and welcome to the channel Anthropohistory and Colonialism. I am Victor Collins, anthropologist, and today's lecture will be called Opening a Field of Inquiries for Possible Explanations Behind Colonialist Motives and a brief analysis of colonialist rhetoric. Okay, so um, I have pointed out the topic of purposes of Latin colonialism, known as the Holy See. Okay, um, and then it goes. Um, so the prevailing narratives of history differs totally from the process of colonization led by occult orders. Okay, so the real process in history is totally different from the discourse and the narratives that we have been told. Okay, since uh, these Western lands were known already by Rome to have been visited by previous cultures, but this was never admitted, of course. As Columbus was taken to America by William Harris, which is an Irish salesman, and this is already a known fact through the alternative history. And St. Brendan's voyage were legendary among leading seamen such as Cabral, Vespuccio, and others from the times of the maritime expansion. What are the hidden motivations for the Holy See? Or what were the hidden motivations for the Holy See expansion? Okay, so now we have a thesis which is shared by more than an author, which says that so-called royal elite bloodlines might have descended from an ancient off-world imperialistic intervention that performed a forced hybridization in ancient times, and this led the earth to a forced quarantine situation. Okay, so this intervention um, is encoded even in the Bible. Okay, in the famous passages, the famous passage that says that the sons of God lust after the daughters of men, and then came the offspring called the men of renown. Well, um, the thesis is based on the idea that Western elites descend directly from these interventors as their hybrid offspring. And this may happen in Atlantis, not only, okay, but for the present lecture, which is of course a limited frame. Um, we're gonna remain only in Atlantis, okay? Even though there is evidence that this hybridization involves other cultures and other lands also, okay? And and then I will quote one of the authors that developed this work very clearly and very competently, which is Michael Tissarian in his Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation in Origins and Oracles. Okay, so the whole thesis is there. Now, why did I assume this thesis for my work? Well, the reason is that the evidence for this thesis appears in the manifestations of colonialism in history. And these manifestations are slavery, the culture of punishment, the inhuman nature within collective murders of natives in a ritualized way as a sort of a payment for occult powers behind the colonialist process. Okay, so we can have it as an example Cortez in Mexico and the murder of millions of people in a very short time and in an obviously well schematic way, which is a ritualized form. Okay, so as if this was a kind of a repayment for the services behind the services from the powers behind the European elites. And even Michael Tissarion will say that there is a parallel between these ritual murders and the modern wars, okay, which unfortunately are well planned and well organized as a ritual sacrifice. Okay, of course, this sounds very scary and very dark, but the evidence in history is unmistaken. So it's about time to delve in the occult and see how the historical evidence fits within the thesis. Okay. Um, okay. We can find also evidence in history um, in the inhuman indifference for suffering of peoples and animals that might indicate a rule performed by hybrid elites and the occult presence of a non-human force behind them. Okay, so the mistreatment of native peoples through women and children, for example, uh, the totally inadequate enslavement to harvest minerals and or other sorts of of natural resources from very hard labor, and the the total disrespect for animals with the culture of carnivorism. So one of the big catastrophical evidences in the colonialist process is the ecological devastation, the turning of forests into fields for cattle and all of this kind of deeply predatory activity that simply escalated out of control, right? So these evidences in history might suggest that the thesis is correct, that the elites are actually hybridized bloodlines, and behind them there is a non-human presence which is leading the process despite all the suffering, the slavery, and the injustices towards women and children and so on. Okay. Now, um, within the same thesis, we will point out the theme of technology and resources. Of course, we were led to think that technology is a very recent activity, the fabrication of technological machines and devices and all of this, but this is not true. We know since the Renaissance that there's a lot of resource and, pardon me, a lot of investment and effort directed to develop advanced technology. Okay, so the materials to build advanced technology giving the elites a strategic advantage instead of merely backing an economical financial system. With this, I mean that the gold, the silver, the crystals, the diamonds, they were actually the raw material to develop advanced technology, right? And at the same time, they serve to back an economical financial system. Since these technologies, according to the thesis, that these elites are actually hybrid bloodlines, these materials will serve the purpose of building technology that would allow eventually these elites to vacate the quarantine of the planet Earth. Okay? And of course, this thesis is very different from the common nonsense because we've been told that in the past civilizations were limited or precarious, which is nothing but lies. We know that there was very high technology in, in in ancient times, in Atlantis and in many other cultures, right? High advanced technologies, and that the off-world presence is nothing new. Okay, so this argument that the harvesting of natural resources serve the purpose of developing high technology really makes sense. Okay, so the technology, the technological advantage of the elites subjugated to Rome would advance a global agenda of world domination, exemplified by English as the lingua franca after Latin, which is the language that the whole world speaks, an imperial geography centered in Britain through the official maps, and a Western-based financial system. So we have, of course, the foundation of an economical system based on these raw materials, such as gold and diamonds, right? We have a world domination agenda being put into play, right? Within the linguistic domination, since English is actually one of the myriad of languages spoken on the earth, and after Latin it has become sort of universal. Okay, so this is directly related to this world domination agenda. Okay, and also the whole world, whatever we like it or not, is based on a Western financial system, right? So these 3 points they relate, okay, the raw materials for high technology and the world domination agenda, and the concept that explains this process is globalization. Okay. Well, so quoting again, actually referencing again to Michael Tessarion, that will point out that the occult orders behind the colonialist process, remember that the whole the Holy See colonialist process has been entirely from the start based on occult orders, and that's why it's so important to be symbolically literate, because they are informing all that we need to know, but through encoded information, through symbols, through terms, through architecture. And actually, this is coming since ancient times when imperialism has been established, specifically through Imperial Egypt and also Persia, right? That through the Roman Empire became the basis of Latin colonialism, as we have seen in a previous lecture. Okay, so the occult orders behind the colonialist process, the Holy See, would hire geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci to develop advanced technologies so they could serve the occult agenda, and eventually make these technologies perform to the point that these elites could vacate the quarantine over the planet, right? We do have a lot of material and work from Da Vinci in high technologies, and the very term Leonardo da Vinci, which is not necessarily the name of a man, right? When we break down, it means the great lion that wins. So this is a simple relation to the imperial Egyptian based occult orders from the ancient past that appear in modern time Latin colonialism. So it's a reference to the Lion of Judah, right? And even the term Columbus, which means dove, Columba in Latin means dove, is actually a reference to the what I will call, through the author Mustafa Gadala. No, sorry, through Ahmed Osman. Right? The term dove refers to the Atenist royal dynasty, specifically the military field commanders of the Atenist royal dynasty that were known as the Davuds in Hebraic, and later in Latin it becomes David. Okay, so it's, and then comes Mustafa Gadala that has made this research. So it's TWT, Tut, becomes Davud in Hebraic, and then David in Latin. Okay, so the term David is the same as dove, which is the same as Columba. So this is a very famous Latin military symbol. Okay, and is very present among the occult orders that led the process of Latin colonialism. Okay, right. So here are some effects in history of colonialism, such as the predatory nature of the missions that wanted to eradicate at all cost the native peoples and take their ways of living, their residence, sacred places under arrest, to build temples and facilities and tools for control of these peoples. So the most famous case, of course, is the Jesuits over the Guarani people. The Guarani are very wide population that extends from Brazil to Paraguay, and we know through studies of many anthropologists, Darcy Ribeiro from Brazil, or even Rudolf Steiner, talks about the occult ways that the Jesuits controlled these native peoples. So the famous saying of the Jesuits that, quote, "You give me a child, and by the time of 7 years old, he's mine forever." And also the task of evangelizing. Okay, so that's what these missionaries were doing. And even in the US, the Jesuit missions came illegally in a sort of a non permitted way to take control. The same thing with these very dark methods. Okay, so these elites and their uh, authoritarian orders, such as the Jesuits, they were absolutely determined to take control of all these lands. They had methods to control the native peoples, right? And the effects are the destruction and even the genocide of many, many native peoples in a very deeply predatory way. And this is very known by the disappearance of native peoples, destructions of their ways of life, uh, opening the way for Jesuit control. Okay. One may be aware that in the modern world, the term Columba is everywhere, like Columbia Records, Columbia Pictures, or even the term Virgin, right? These terms, they all refer to the same elites from the times of colonialism and their secret orders, right? So in another way of saying, I said this before, we do not make in this channel conspiracy theories, but we analyze the conspiratorial takeover of the modern world, as there were radically different projects for all the countries, but the power centered in the Holy See and Rome took over in a very efficient way, but with very catastrophic effects based on the predatorial means. Okay, and these are facts of history. Whatever we like it or not, it is a catastrophe that has succeeded, so to speak. Okay. The first universities that were founded in the colonies, okay, now we can refute the lie of a new world, right? There was never a new world. uh, it is clear that the whole prevailing official narrative is entirely misinformation and deception from the start, and the elites knew the truth from day one. So, with the alternative research, we now can assume some facts that there was no new world, and Rome knew very well that there were previous cycles of maritime expansion, okay, and and then they took a lot of effort to define these prevailing narratives, the whole misinformation, and the very concept of history. What history means, that I will break down in a moment. Okay, so the universities designed to serve the young people deriving from the elites, uh, with the purpose to educate them in the agenda of world domination. In other words, these young people, the selected few by the elites, were pointed out to become knowers of the occult agenda of the elites, the true agenda, not the misinformation, not the prevailing narratives. No, what they were truly doing in these native lands, right? And why they were using these methods of evangelization, um the um, the purpose of the missions, and even the darker aspects, right? Like the ritual murders of so many native people, the enslavement, right? The In these universities, these young people under the elites agenda were taught the justifications for enslavement. So they read the some of the earlier fathers of Christianity that were involved not only in the destruction and the theft of so much material and scrolls and papyri from the Library of Alexandria that was taken directly to Rome, right? Just as the corruption of many theses um, through the corruption of Aristotle, for example, um, Christian fathers like Saint Cyril and even Saint Jerome, so and Saint Augustine, right? All of them led a hand through the philosophical and theological authorities to justify the enslavement of people and to produce the narratives and discourses that I will call here rhetoric, and we will analyze in a moment. And the total desacralization of the land and civilization against nature paradigm, okay, which is simply the land being rendered to exploitation mainly. And this has been said famously by Chief Sealth to the authorities of Washington. This I quote through the beautiful work of Joseph Campbell, which is called The Hero's Journey. And there it says that Chief Sealth warned everyone that times of abundance and harmony were ending, and the coming of survival mode and competition was certain. So basically, the roots of the whole ecological catastrophe that walked side by side with the process of colonialism. As I said, the destruction of forests to open fields for cattle and the culture of carnivorism. Okay, and there is a link between this this ecological devastation way back to imperial Egypt. As I mentioned, the secret orders that led the colonialist process, they refer to imperial Egypt through pyramids such as we see in the Knights of Malta, or the term Columba, which is a reference, as I said, to the Davids, the Atonist military commanders, right? And I mentioned in a previous lecture that when the central sun cult of the Aten or Aton took over in imperial Egypt, two main changes happening radically. So one is the total demand, the demand for total obedience under the theological and the juridical authorities, with the risk of being judged and punished. Okay, as Freud said in his Moses and Monotheism, the surrendering of the sexual force was another requirement under the cult of the Aton, and the reduction of animals to a supposedly inferior life form that is serving man uh, in a condition that it can be slaughtered. Okay, so carnivorism has its roots in the Western world, very, very likely in Imperial Egypt under the cult of the Aton. And it spread like a plague through Latin colonialism. Okay, right. So now we will analyze what I call the rhetoric of colonialism. Um, the rhetoric covering colonial incursions. Okay, so aside the destructive and predatory practices of colonialism, there is also a discourse, a justification, a thesis, a theory, and so on. Okay, well, so one of the main aspects of colonialism is the continuous propagation of fictive, fictitious misinformation, making the field of historiography the most controlled of all. And this is a quote from the great Conor McDarry, which I recommend deeply the reading of, well, all of his work is superb, but his Irish wisdom preserved in the Bible and Pyramids, which is an incredible breaking down of the colonialist process led by Rome um, in the attempt of taking over Ireland, and also how they hid the whole previous cycle influenced by the Magi um, under the Holy See colonialism. It's an incredible story of deception and misinformation and betrayal, right, of the Western Magi known as Druids, which also were very, very, very powerful in the Nile civilization known as Cam. Okay, and basically Rome has obscured all of this previous cycle, but has benefited directly from it, right? So this is a very, very interesting work, very powerful work of Conor McDarry. Well, one of the arguments, or simply the rhetoric of the Holy See, is that these native peoples were living out of history. Okay, and this is also a theme that was studied extensively and deeply by the great Georges Ballandier, which is a French anthropologist, an ethnologist that has lived in and made field research in Africa under African colonies, including through the process of independence. So it is actually a revolutionary ethnologist, Georges Ballandier, which is basically when anthropology ceases to be a servant for the colonial authorities and becomes a critic of the colonialist process in history, welcoming these native peoples uh, within the historical process, since they are expressing millennial old cultures that were trading with one another, and including part of the greater historical dynamics. Okay, so the colonial concept of history uh, is defined over the exploitative labor towards natural resources within the vertical hierarchy based on obedience and punishment, such as the state and the world dominion agenda. Another concept of history based on non-competitive, on spiritual cultures exchanging wisdom and knowledge for a wider evolution, is excluded. So again, that's a subject that Conor McDarry works really deeply in his work that I mentioned. Well, another rhetoric is that these native peoples were primitives, which in a colonialist sense means that life was based on scarcity, precarity, and survival, and such discourse was common previous to Malinowski, the anthropologist that worked in the Trobriand Islands for the British Empire. Okay, Trobriand Islands is near Australia, and the term savages, which means that these natives are inferior to Europeans, okay, in the sense that they lack the obedience based hierarchy of Europe, and even some of these native peoples avoided the formation of the state, which is a subject studied by the French anthropologist Pierre Clastres, which is very shocking, right, to Western societies, that such a native culture worked purposely to avoid the formation of the state. Okay, this happened, and the work of Clastres is known Society Against the State. Okay, it's a very famous work also. Um, well, um, so for a long time, anthropology came as a servant for the aristocratic elites and the theological authorities, such as the Jesuits and many other orders, simply to collect information within the natives, to offer the information to the authorities and facilitate the colonial agenda, right? In all its extension, right? And this has been so for a long time. Okay, of course, there are many variations within anthropologists, within many anthropologists, right? But a true revolution in anthropology, um, which did not happen at once, it was pioneered by let's say Franz Boas or James Fraser, right? Did take place in a radical way in the 60s, when the ex-colonies, especially in the African continent, were organizing to break from the colonial rule, which does not mean necessarily that they succeeded. Of course, we have to analyze case to case, but the work of Georges Ballandier is very interesting in this sense, okay, and it truly honors uh, these native peoples, specifically in Africa, as participating within the wider historical process for thousands of years. Okay, it analyzes the myths, integrates their mythology within the historical process. Okay, and I have done a work exactly analyzing the status of anthropology from a servant of colonialism to a critical analyst of colonialism, revising the work of some authors and explaining how this revolutionary shift happened. Okay, and this is in the book Social Anthropology, an ontological transformation, right? Well, so uh, here we complete our lecture, okay? And the idea is to fit this thesis, as I said in the start, right? Of possible explanations behind colonialist motives, aside the historical effects. We're not deriving conclusions, but if one looks close to the historical effects, one will realize that they do make sense. Okay, so it's not a final conclusion, but as we take these theses and the effects side by side and look to the modern world, we will realize that a lot of these arguments do fit and make sense, and realize essentially that there is a true colonial process led by the secret orders based on hidden agendas and hidden purposes that were never told to anyone, that were never disclosed, and the um, the prevailing the prevailing narratives, rhetorics, and misinformation that we all heard, okay, that by now can be debunked by the alternative research. Thank you very much and see you in the next lecture. Thank you.